Good morning, everyone. My name is Stacey DeCalma, and I'm the Manager for Sector Capacity here at QCOS. Really nice to see you all online. Thank you for joining us. There's quite a few people still trickling in, so I'm just going to give them a minute to get in. And while they're doing that, I'm going to post a few things in the chat that I'm going to be referring to throughout the session today. So I'm just going to put them there so that you can easily find them. Good morning, Alicia, and hi, Terry and Barbara. All right, there's a couple of things I'm going to refer to in the chat. You don't need to, if you would like to, you can open them up on your browser now, and when I get to them, I'll refer to them. But we're also going to link these in a post-event email that you'll all receive. I'm seeing a few QCN members. Welcome to our Quality Collaboration Network members who've joined us today. Now, the way I really approach, good morning, Sarah. Hi. The way we approach sector capacity here at QCOS is really one of, with particular things, one of peer support and sharing and collaboration across the sector. So if at any point you have some wisdom to share with others, or you'd like to make a point, really happy for you to share. And that's the kind of approach that we have across a lot of our activities here. There's a lot of shared knowledge in the room today, a lot of experience in the room. People have been doing quality and compliance type roles for a long time. So I really encourage you to share with one another when you can, not only in this session, but all the time. All right, I think, I'm just having more people trickling in. So I'm just making sure we've got as many as possible in as I can. Now, Sarah, actually, I will just introduce Sarah before I get started. Sarah's on the line and she is part of the sector capacity team here at QCOS. And Sarah, I might ask you actually to keep your eye on admitting people if you can once I get started, because if someone's a little bit late, I might miss them. All right. Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to move my camera over here now so that I can see properly. All right, let's get this started. All right, I'll just check. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yep, great.
Yes. Yep.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I can see my camera is a bit skewy, so I'm just going to change that. Hopefully that's okay. Let me know if that camera angle is not right, but I think it's all right. Now, good morning. As I mentioned, my name is Stacey DeCalma. I am the Manager of Sector Capacity here at QCOS in our lovely Sector Capacity team. And it's my pleasure today to deliver this workshop to you. Now, this workshop has really been designed as a resource for those in quality or compliance type roles, but particularly for those in organisations, smaller to medium organisations, where you might be doing direct service delivery or frontline type role and have quality and compliance as part of your portfolio of work, but it might not be your dedicated role. And that happens a lot across the sector. We know that the organisations aren't always at a size or resourced to a point where they are able to have a dedicated quality or compliance type role. So I'm really hoping that today's session will give you a good understanding of how to break down a policy, how to understand them, how to maintain them, so that when it comes to those audit or other quality type processes, there isn't a panic in your organisation to get these things under control. But also because we know that policies and robust policies and procedures support quality service delivery, and that's what we want for everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people. It's on their land that I work and am delivering this workshop today. I extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people on the line today. And of course, extend that acknowledgement to the lands and the nations of the land that you're on today. And I encourage you to share that land in the chat, introduce yourselves to one another and the land that you're on. I think it's always nice to get a good idea of the footprint that we have in any given session and where you're all coming from today across Queensland. I'd like to thank First Nations people for the gift of the Uluru Statement from the heart. And we at QCOS look forward to supporting the work leading to a successful referendum to enshrine a First Nations voice to Parliament in the Australian Constitution and followed by treaty. QCOS welcomes the invitation to work with First Nations people in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. We have got someone who isn't on mute, so I'm just going to encourage everyone to check whether or not they're on mute, because if you're not, we might hear what's going on around you. I'm going to check the chat periodically through the session today. And if you've got a comment or a question, please pop it in there and I hope to get to it. So the session today, we're going to look at what a policy is, what the difference is between policy and procedure, writing a policy, maintaining a policy, and we'll have a quick look at the HSQF templates that are available for sector use, acknowledging that not all of you are in scope of the HSQF, but those templates I think are quite useful even if you're using them under different quality frameworks. So we'll have a look at those and what's available. So what is policy? For many who don't interact with policy a lot, policies can seem like a bit of a dry document that sits somewhere that might not actually have much to do with their day-to-day practice, but really it's a set of ideas or a plan of what to do in a particular situation that's been agreed to. It's a mandatory statement of the principles guiding an organisation's operations and its decision-making, and it's established by a resolution or a governance body of some kind or a senior officer with delegated authority of that body. And policies are binding statements and they apply across the organisation and support the organisation's course of action for the foreseeable future until they're reviewed or amended. And so generally, they're not changed really frequently. They're generally documents that will be periodically reviewed, but they will generally be a really solid or robust document through which we can have our practice guided and where our organisational values are really clear to us. Policies guide the actions towards the desired outcome of the organisation. So we have a look at policy versus procedure. Policy differ from rules of the law, which can compel or prohibit behaviour. So policy isn't law. But policies are guiding principles. They reflect the principles and vision and mission of the organisation. They tell us how, why, or what. They identify issues and the scope for which the policy lays under, and they're not hard and fast rules, whereas procedures are a specific way of doing things. So the practical application of a policy. They tell us how, when, or who. And they establish steps. They're stricter in nature and they have a specified set of rules or a particular procedure to follow. Now, what makes a good policy? Policy makes administration easier. They should make our life easier. They're not overcomplicated. They enable an organisation's core business to be efficient and effective. They provide a framework for confident and consistent decision-making, which is really important for our service delivery. And they're clearly aligned with the organisation's values, missions, and principles. Now, procedure is how policy is practically applied. It provides instructions and options to guide staff through common activities they undertake at work. So good procedures operationalise your policies. They guide staff in their decisions and actions. They improve consistency of service delivery, and that's particularly in larger organisations where you might even have multiple sites. And they outline responsibilities and give staff authority to act. So they really help everyone feel quite confident in what they're doing. Now, here's an organisational policy checklist. This is from the Workplace Policies and Procedures from New South Wales Industrial Relations, but I think this is a good policy checklist for us to refer to. So we need to ensure that our policies are consistent with the values of our organisation, that they comply with relevant legislation. That's really important. Demonstrate organisation is operated in an efficient and business-like manner. They ensure uniformity and consistency, and I've referred to that already, and I think that's a really important part of what policies and procedures offer services. They really do foster that stability and continuity, and they maintain direction. So even in circumstances that may be a bit rocky, we've seen a few of those over the last couple of years through pandemic, natural disasters, etc. Policies and procedures really maintain a standard and they maintain direction, even in unfamiliar territory. And that clarity of function and responsibility in those periods of that may be unsettling is really important to us. Now, policy in the Human Rights Act. As you review policies and procedures to align with the Human Rights Act, there are a few key themes to keep in mind. Now, I think we're all, most of us are at the stage now where we're aware of the Human Rights Act, whether or not it applies to our organisation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And now the sector is really getting to a stage where we're getting much better at actually applying the Human Rights Act to our work. And hopefully most of us have gotten to a stage where we're starting to ensure that the Human Rights Act is embedded in our policies and procedures. Okay, so there's 4 key things to keep in mind when we're looking at our policies with this lens. The first is language. So individuals are rights bearers, and it's essential to reflect this in your choices in your policies. You must also recognise that policy language influences your organisation's, the language that your organisations or team uses, and therefore the culture in your organisation. So your chosen language will really set the tone for how staff implement policies. So try to use positive narratives to highlight human rights, and incorporating human rights will modify the way that staff have always worked. So it's crucial that it's not a burden and it doesn't seem difficult to do. Number 2 is the relevance. So it's important to contextualise human rights and make them relevant to the work that you're doing. Procedures provide an opportunity to identify common human rights engaged in decisions and actions. So you can give examples or reference case studies to show how you would like staff to approach a particular situation or work activity. And that's more for our procedure side of things. Individualism. Human rights apply to individuals. Procedures that historically dictated an outcome now need to be applied with consideration for a person's individual circumstances. So it will really help staff if procedures identify common points where proper consideration for human rights is needed prior to decisions being made. And obviously we get more and more comfortable with this, and our decision making becomes more fluid as we become more familiar with how the Human Rights Act can be applied. It's really, it's also necessary to consider human rights holistically. So you need to look further than just the rights relevant to the service you deliver, and consider the rights relevant to the person's circumstances more broadly. It's crucial to guide staff in considering the rights of all people involved. So when writing your policies and procedures, remind staff to consider the rights of all the people involved and what's relevant to the situation, not just the individual service user. And number 4 is equality. So as you review policies and procedures, it's really important to remember that the Human Rights Act is equal to all other state legislation. So it's not, we need to apply it as we would any other legislation that we've got in our policies. Identify the Human Rights Act as you would identify any other relevant legislation in your policy. And it's worth remembering that legislation that sits above your organisation's policies and procedures will likely challenge or request changes to policies and procedures to respond to the implementation of the Human Rights Act. So as staff get more familiar with the Human Rights Act, they might identify things in your policies and procedures that need to be tweaked. And that's great. All right, just going to check any questions so far. Not yet. Great. Oh, it's really lovely to see people acknowledging their country. Thank you. All right. ensuring your policies and procedures are Human Rights Act compliant. Firstly, is your organisation a public entity? Look, a lot of organisations who are receiving government funding are considered functional public entities. And if I encourage you to contact their Queensland Human Rights Commission if you're not sure about that. But why would you choose to opt in if you're not already defined under the Act as a public entity? Well, it's good practice. You're proactively considering human rights, setting a standard, ensuring that human rights risks don't become business risks. And businesses that support human rights have a good reputation and people want to work with or for them. So, I mean, technically, there's some organisations that may or may not need to sit under the Human Rights Act, but considering human rights is quite obviously good practice. Now, here's a simple 4-step process for proper consideration under the Human Rights Act. Now, this isn't strictly a policy tip, but it is certainly something to be considering when we're looking at amending our policies to align with the Human Rights Act and supporting our organisational staff to become really familiar with decision making under the Act. So number 1 is purposeful outcome. So be really clear about the purpose of your service and clarify the outcome you're wanting to achieve in making this service decision. Number 2 is to identify rights. So have a look at the human rights of all the people involved in this situation and understand how they're going to be impacted by the decision that you as an organisation are making. Number 3 is to test compatibility. With your decision in mind, answer these 5 questions to check if your decision is compatible with human rights. Is it lawful? Is there a purpose? Is it rational? So will the action or decision effectively achieve your purpose? Is it necessary? Is this the least restrictive way you can achieve your purpose? Is it fair and balanced? So do the benefits outweigh the harm caused by the limitation? And number 4 is justifying your decision. So document a clear justification for the decision, demonstrating the consideration given to human rights. And this should include a statement explaining the potential outcome for those involved and outline the factors that were weighted up at the time the decision was made. I'm just letting some people in. There we go. Welcome to those just joining us. To those who've just joined us, we've just gone through some the definition of policies and procedures, and we've just had a look at the Human Rights Act. Those who've just joined us, would you mind popping yourself on mute? Thanks very much.
Actually, I just muted me. Should we just quickly do it so that because you got to go, but I'll just have this in the background.
Are you going to be here all day?
Sorry, could you just put yourself on mute?
But there's meetings in the afternoon, like 3 to 4 and then 4 to...
Let me see if I
This is recorded, so I can go back and anything I missed, I'll get it. Yeah, it's all right.
Excuse me?
Yeah, I'm in.
Could you put yourself on mute, please?
Oh.
Thank you. I love that realization when people realize they're not on mute. Okay, moving on to the next one, the policy cycle. Okay, so there's some key steps to policy development in theory. Now here we see this policy cycle is by Bridgman and Davis. It's the policy cycle that they've designed. So while it looks nice and neat, the truth is that it's rarely a neat process. I know that this is a very neat diagram, but in practicality, we know, for those of us who have been involved in policy development, maintenance, etc., it doesn't really look like this. However, this does show us what flow makes sense when developing and maintaining policy. So looking at this cycle, you'll be able to recognise things that your organisation does to fulfil parts of this process. For example, you will have multiple mechanisms through which you identify issues, and they might be things like client service, user feedback, staff surveys, or an issues register. So looking through this cycle, you're going to be able to go, yeah, you know, this is what we do in that part of the cycle and this is what we do next. And you'll be able to identify parts of that process that you already do. So it may not be always that fluid or that linear, but there are logical stages of problem solving that happen in policy development. Now, here is a screenshot of the QCOS website where the Human Services Quality Framework policy templates are kept. And that was a link that I put in the beginning of the chat at the beginning of the webinar. So this is where you're going to be able to find lots of policy templates, regardless as to whether you are under the HSQF. There will be something in there that is probably going to be helpful to you. A lot of the content from today you will be able to find in the Policy and Procedures Guideline, that navy box at the top of the screen in the browser when you have a look at this link. And these policy templates have been designed for the sector to use as they wish. You can put your own branding on them, and you can see that they have been organised into the 6 different HSQF standards. And you can find them all sorted in there. But even if you're not in scope of the HSQF, there are many in there that would be useful to you. And just this week, we've added another box under Standard 6, which is governance policies templates. So you might find some things in there that are useful to you as well. Now, we have these templates available for organisations to use because they're fairly simple. You can make them your own by replacing the logo with your own organisational logo, amending them as you require. And yeah, I think it's fairly self-explanatory how to use them, particularly with the Policy and Procedure Guideline. But at any point you need some support using these templates, just get in touch with QCOS. We'd be really happy to help you. Now, let's have a look at the elements of policy, and you'll identify these in the templates on the in the HSQF templates available, but they're also elements that you will probably be quite familiar with if you're involved in policy in your own organisation. I'm going to go through the purpose of these different elements, and feel free to add in the chat if you've got anything else that you'd like to add to what I'm saying. So firstly, we have the document code or version number. So in each policy and procedure, there's a space for you to put in the document code or a version number. And look, this is fairly self-explanatory. It helps us keep track of the document. So it's part of our document control. They're not mandatory. And if you don't wish to have the document or version numbers, you can delete that text from the line. But it's helpful for us to keep that there because we know when the document was last amended, when it needs to be reviewed next. Now, at the top of most policies, you will find a policy statement. And a policy is simply your organisation's position on a particular issue. And together, policy statements in each policy and procedure are your organisation's principles with regard to how your organisation is managed and how services are delivered. So policy statements should always lead into procedures that direct your staff on how to act and implement your policies. Policies are usually written to reflect legislative, regulatory and other compliance requirements, but as a reflection of your organisation, they should also be personalised so that your staff and clients have a clear understanding of your organisation's approach. So simple language is really encouraged. Now we have the scope. So scope is what parts of your organisation does the policy and procedure apply to. Perhaps the document is relevant to your human resources team, or maybe it's for your support workers. So scope should be written for the main users of the policy and procedure. And it can be really tempting to put all staff in this section. However, this often leads to confusion down the track. To help, think about who would need to read the policy and procedure during their induction period. And that's a really good thing to keep in mind. Policies should be written for those who are using them. So when we're thinking about the language we're using, that's really important. Policies and procedures are fairly useless of those who are using them. The meaning of them or the language used doesn't reflect their own understanding of the work that they're doing. And then we have HSQF related standards. So again, if you're not in scope of the HSQF, this might not be part of your policy development. But in the templates that we've provided, these are for organisations obviously complying with HSQF. The indicators that the policy relates to are listed here. This is not a mandatory part of policy, but it might be something you find helpful. because listing the relevant quality standards or indicators, whether they're related to HSQF or another framework that you're working with, help make it clear what the policy relates to. And this can be particularly important or useful if a standard or indicator is amended, because you can go directly to the policies that have that indicator listed, and you know that there's probably going to be something within that policy that needs to be tweaked. Then we have references or related legislation. And this section, it lists relevant legislation or regulation or departmental policy, etc. So if you're complying with the HSQF, this is as per the mandatory requirements in the HSQF user guide. And it has been set up so that you can easily remove references if they don't apply to your organisation or the service that you're delivering. So staying abreast of legislative changes can be really challenging. And this is something, you know, if you're part of the Quality Collaboration Network, we talk about quite a bit. It can be hard to keep on top of all of the different changes that happen. Peer support is one of the best ways to keep on top of legislative challenges, networking with other organisations that deliver similar services. But some other ways to help might be subscribing to departmental newsletters through your relevant peak body. I know here at QCOS, we often put out newsletters that detail legislative changes. Through an employer association membership or through the Australian Legal Information Institute or through specialist websites, there are some you can pay a subscription and get updates to legislation through that. There are currently several Queensland government departments that come under the HSQF. So if your organisation has agreements with more than one department, you might need to note this in your policies and procedures. Okay, so definitions. These have been provided in the policies and procedures where they might be unfamiliar terms. However, customization of this section in the policies is really encouraged if you use different terms in your organisation. And not every policy and procedure template has this section. So if you think it's necessary in your organisation to make your policy robust and to ensure that those who are using the policy really understand what it means, by all means, put it in. We have a really transient workforce in the community services sector. And even in my communication engagement with different organisations, I have sometimes noticed that different workers will have a different understanding of some terms. We go from one organisation to the next. We might take our understanding of a term with us, and it might not be that new organisation's understanding of the term. A good example of this might be a term like cultural safety. What does that really mean? What does that mean to a worker? What does that mean to the organisation they work with? So writing down definitions, or at least putting them down in a policy, is a really useful way to ensure, as long as we're familiar with our policies and we're using them frequently, referring to them frequently, to ensure we're all on the same page, that when we say something, this is what we actually mean by it. And it could be a great exercise for you as an organisation to have the discussion around particular terms and what they really mean for all of you. Okay, so then we have principles. So again, it's not a compulsory part of policies, but it might be useful. Particularly for some policies, it's helpful for those using the policy to understand the underpinning principles that are guiding the stance of this policy. For example, choice. Choice might be a principle that your organisation really holds. It's an important one that stands out in your policy. So some organisations will opt to include underpinning principles in their policy statement to make that really clear. Again, that's an organisational choice. Now, procedure. This is a section, some people include procedures in policies, others have procedures and policies divided. That's an organisational decision. That's up to you whether or not you keep those separate or if you have them in the same document. Different organisations have different ways of approaching that. So if you are including procedure in your policy, obviously this is very customised to your organisation. Because you will all deliver services differently. You have different sized organisations, so different numbers of people involved in any given process. So this one is a section that you're going to be writing with your team and coming up with something that's quite unique to you and your organisation. Okay, so then we have, I'm just quickly checking that we haven't got anyone else in the waiting room. No, we look fine. All right, so related policies and procedures. Again, really useful to know. Policies are never just a standalone document that have no bearing on anything else. They're very much intersecting with other pieces of work and other policies and procedures in our organisation. So this section lists which policies or procedures intersect with the policy you're currently reading, which gives guidance to those using the policy, because if this policy intersects with something else, we might need to refer to that one as well to get some more information. So it shows how particular policies work with one another. And also when we're reviewing policies, really useful for us to know what does intersect, because amending one might have a flow-on effect to another one. So that's a useful section to keep updated. And of course, we have supporting documents. So this section is referencing related documents to the policy that you're looking at. It indicates to your staff where else they might need to look for relevant information, or what particular form they need to access to complete a process or a task. It can also be really helpful when you need to make changes to a process, as it will give you a prompt to check related or supporting documents in case changes need to be made to those documents as well. So I mentioned earlier in the webinar that generally speaking, policies are not very frequently changed, but it's those supporting documents and procedures that might be the more frequently changed parts. And of course, we have review. So policies and procedures and any related forms, registers, etc., need to be reviewed on a regular as needs basis. Regardless of how often they need updating, there should always be some kind of plan to inform when that will be, so it doesn't fall off everyone's radar, because that is very easy. That easily happens, very easily happens, particularly in small organisations, again, where there isn't a quality or compliance dedicated role or team, and it's someone's doing frontline service delivery, that we refresh or review policies, then before you know it, 3 years has gone by and it's time for your next HSQF audit, and you might not have actually reviewed them since then. So happens a lot. So having some kind of process to ensure it doesn't fall off the radar and it happens periodically is really important. In each policy and procedure template, there's a space for you to put when the document was last reviewed, and you can add when the next review will be if you would like to, or you can put that in a separate document as a review register or a plan. So we don't need to review all documents in the same time frame. Some documents might need more frequent review due to legislation or risk associated with them, or because of other changes. So a 1 to 3 year time frame for a review is generally considered acceptable. 3 years is the HSQF certification cycle, so this makes sense for policies that don't require frequent updating, but you will, as an organisation, will decide how frequently particular policies need reviewing. So how do we maintain them? We really need, so here we have a policy. This is just a register example. Funnily enough, the best way to maintain policies is to have a formalized process or a policy for it. So as I've mentioned previously, not all policies need to be reviewed or amended frequently, but there does need to be some kind of plan for reviewing them so they aren't left to become irrelevant or stagnant. Now, happily, reviewing a policy does not necessarily mean it needs to be changed. So we might have a mechanism through which we review it. Doesn't mean that a lot is going to change in the policy, but it means that someone's had a look at it and has gone, yep, you know, everything's okay here. Nothing needs to be changed this time around. So it really does pay to have a process where all of our different documentation is looked at periodically. Now, an organisation needs to assess which of their policies need to be reviewed more frequently and which ones are less likely to need frequent updating. So examples of policies which might be reviewed annually rather than 3 yearly, for example, might be a child and youth risk management behaviour support, or policies that are emerging areas for your organisation, like human rights. So once you have evaluated how frequently you're comfortable with reviewing the policy, you can then create a review schedule. And then that will align with your either board or management committee and their process for approving documents. So having a plan for the year ahead or the 3-year cycle might be really useful for your organisation to have, to know when we're going to be reviewing particular documents, then at what meeting they might be approved, etc. It really helps us allocate time to things like client feedback or consultation, which might inform policy, as well as those approval processes that I've referenced. But note that legislative changes may mean that policies are reviewed sooner rather than later. One thing we know is that plans always need some kind of flexibility. So we might need to amend that review plan. Okay, so particularly in smaller organisations where there may not be resources to have dedicated quality or compliance roles, things like policy development and maintenance can be one of those things that are really easily and understandably put on the back burner. And you're absolutely not alone if that's your experience. So here are 3 tips for maintaining policy in your organisation. As we've discussed just now, have a plan. If there's no plan to maintain policy, it's really unlikely to happen unless something occurs, which means you absolutely have to review and update. For some organisations, this happens when there's an incident, or for others, it's when their audit comes up. It's really hard to get on top of all that needs to happen if it's left until audit time. So for a more pleasant auditing experience, it really pays to have a plan to fit quality and compliance into the organisation's day-to-day running. And that might align with management committee meetings or board meetings. They might have it as a regular policy review as an agenda item. Find a way that it's regularly coming into your sphere as an organisation. Utilise peer support. I think it's become pretty clear by now that I'm a big fan of peer support across the sector. There's so many quality and compliance focused peers out there in the sector. So get in touch with them, get connected with them. You can come along to the Quality Collaboration Network. We meet monthly via Zoom. At the end of this webinar, I'll post a link to our next meeting registration link. And keep in touch with others doing similar work to you. We have really great discussions, and someone else is likely to have the same question or issue as you. It's free to be involved. It doesn't take anything other than your time, obviously, to get connected with other organisations across the sector, whether or not they're doing similar service delivery to you, or whether they just might have similar approaches to practice as you. Organisations will have really similar challenges coming up, and connecting with your peers across the sector is a great way to tackle some of those challenges. And ensuring that quality is seen as something that aids service delivery rather than something that's a big burden. So it's true that quality and compliance does often come with red tape. It can take time, and for many, it's a far less exciting part of their job. Not necessarily less exciting, but less pressing part of their job. A lot of you are doing frontline service delivery, and obviously that is, it's important. And it's not something that can just be put aside for something that's paper-based. But we know that good policy and procedure supports good practice. So it's really important to make some kind of time for quality in our organisations. So involving colleagues in quality updates and letting people know what happened to their feedback is one of the ways that we can ensure that they feel like policy and procedure review is a really important part of their work. So letting people know what happens to survey results or consultations that you do as a team internally, and finding some way for policy review to be fun is something that you might find useful in your organisation. I used to work somewhere where our quality and compliance officer would send out an email on a Friday afternoon, and the email would have a question in it about a particular detail in a policy. And the first person who could answer her question that was in alignment with the policy got a prize. It was something like a Frodo frog or something like that. But I tell you what, during that period where she used to do that, it was, and I can't actually remember now how long it went on for, but I have never opened so many policies and gotten as familiar with where they were on our intranet and where to find them as I did during that period when she was doing that. That's just a fun way that she got quite a few people in the organisation to actually go and find policies and open them up and search for a particular part of them to answer her question. So that's just, I've always remembered that because she found a way to make it fun, and it was really good. Okay, was there any comments anyone would like to make? Anything that they find really useful in policy maintenance in their own organisations? I'll let you think on that and pop it in the chat, or take yourself off mute if you've got something to share. But in the meantime, I wanted to say that there are on the website, and I'll post the link in the chat, there are the policy templates, there are the governance templates. I've posted a link to the next Quality Collaboration Network meeting, which is on the 20th of July. That's next Wednesday, this time next week. That meeting is the focus for that meeting will be combining audits. So if you're an organisation that is complying with HSQF, but you might also be complying with other quality frameworks, you might find that meeting really useful. But as I said, we have general discussions in the Quality Collaboration Network meetings that will be really useful to you if you have responsibilities that are to do with quality and compliance in your organisation. There's also a HSQF e-learning module on Community Door and a few other resources there that you can find. So if you're looking for any support to do with quality and compliance in your organisation, please get in touch. QCOS is really happy to support organisations, and we can do one-on-one support too if you're finding that you're needing a little bit more than what the resources provide for you. I also want to mention the Queensland Community Impact Awards because there are a few awards that I think that many of you would be eligible to nominate for. Either someone in your organisation or an organisation you know of doing really good work across 3 different areas. One is community impact, one is frontline hero, and the other is human rights impact. We're really interested to hear from organisations who are doing good work in this space. So if that is you or your organisation or an organisation you know of or a peer in the sector, please send them the nomination information because we would really love to hear from them. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see our chat. Oops, I don't want to do a new share. I want to stop sharing. There we go. All right, great. I'm going to put my camera back up here so I can see all your faces. So any questions, comments that anyone would like to make? Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you found it useful. It can be really hard to keep on top of these things as a small organisation in particular, I think. But I find that when I put a question out to the sector, in my experience, people have been really forthcoming in being helpful and supporting one another in the sector. So I really do encourage you to rely on your sector peers for support with these kinds of things because there's some really clever people out there doing really good work. And if you're in a role doing frontline service delivery, you don't reinvent the wheel if it doesn't need to be reinvented, because there will be another organisation out there doing similar work to you with policies and procedures that you can learn from. So we will send out a post-event email later today with some links in it of some of the content that I've covered in this session. But we did QCOS delivered a project over the last, it ended in March this year, but it was over about an 18-month period around embedding human rights in service delivery, particularly in the housing and homelessness sector, which I know not all of you are from, but there was a huge amount of really helpful resources developed through that project. And a lot of it actually relates to policy development and procedure and aligning them with the Human Rights Act. So in the post-event email, I will link to the page where those resources are, because there's some really, really useful stuff in there, particularly things like amending your complaints process, for example. So there's an example there of how to actually unpack a policy that you currently have and look at it with that human rights lens and go, you know, is there anything in here that could be improved to respect an individual's human rights? So I will link those in the post-event email because I think they're really, really useful for the sector to use. I'm loving the comments here. Thank you very much. I love it when people engage in the chat. Yeah, look, Julie, I think that getting teams to learn more about policies, yeah, I mean, chocolate is a great incentive for many people, isn't it? But you can find something or some kind of way to include policy review, or even just getting familiar with policies in our day-to-day practices. And I really think that that is one of the keys to making sure that quality and compliance doesn't fall off our radar, particularly for those smaller organisations, because honestly, the 3 years between audits can go like that, and suddenly those policies and procedures really need quite intensive review, and that's a lot of work to do in a short period of time. But again, when we're rushing that process, we don't have time to do adequate consultation or get client feedback and feed it into those reviews. So we want to ensure that we are including the view of our service users or clients. It's really important that we have as well thought out process for reviewing those policies and procedures. And I think folding it into day-to-day practice is the only real way that we can do that properly. I think I might have given you all 15 minutes back into your day. So I will finish up there, but I do really want to encourage you to get in touch should you need some HSQF or organisational support. Really happy to walk you through the policies and procedures provided on the QCOS website. And if you do have a particular question about policy or practice, and you think that some peers in the sector would be able to assist you with answering it, really happy to facilitate that. As I mentioned, the Quality Collaboration Network is a great group of people who are very generous with their time and their knowledge in the sector. I'm just going, for anyone that missed it before, I'm just going to post the registration link for that group here. So we meet monthly. We meet on the third Wednesday of every month between February and November. It's free. It's a free network. We meet via Zoom. So as long as you've got an internet connection, you can connect with the group. We meet for an hour and a half. Every month we have a focus topic, and we spend about half of the meeting on that focus topic. And for the second half of the meeting, we have general discussion around quality and compliance matters. So a really good resource for anyone who may not have a team that they share quality and compliance responsibilities with. So you can utilize the QCN as your quality and compliance team. That's really how I view them. Great bunch of people. That's an exciting day for you, Roxanne, going through the policy manual. I hope you've got some snack. Maybe you can get some chocolate frogs for yourself. Well, look, I hope that you have found something in today's session that's useful for you. As I said, get in touch if you would like to. Please consider the Community Impact Awards and whether or not your organisation would be eligible for or even an individual would be eligible for one of those awards. I will post the link again in the chat right now. Check that out. And I hope to see your face again. Maybe I'll see your face in the next QCN meeting. All right, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. And thanks again for joining me.